Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of The Amateur Traveler is brought to you by Audible. Please visit audiblepodcast.com/traveler for your free audiobook download.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. 15
Amateur Traveler, episode 183. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about geysers and bison and the majestic beauty of Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into the interview, I do have some news stories for you. The first one is a cautionary tale. Please, 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 when the seatbelt sign is on and you're flying, follow that, especially if you're in turbulence. A Texas woman who got up to use the lavatory ignoring the fasten seatbelt sign is now paralyzed because of turbulence. So, please. And then thinking of things that you shouldn't do, probably one of them would be mention to your seatmate that you have a bomb. Especially if you don't, but probably even if you do, and that's what somebody did at the Denver airport. As you can imagine, they were arrested. And then thinking of other things that I wouldn't do, that would probably include hiking naked in Switzerland, and that's now illegal, at least in one town in Switzerland, because they were a little tired of the German nudists who were taking advantage of their local trails. Check out the link to those three stories, as well as some other stories. My favorite was the 20 ridiculous complaints made by holidaymakers. One of them was a woman threatened to call police after claiming that she'd been locked in by staff, when in fact she had mistaken the Do Not Disturb sign on the back of the door as a warning to remain in the room. Links to all of those stories at the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Before we get into this week's interview, I want to thank our sponsor, which is audible.com. Audible.com is the internet's leading provider in spoken audio entertainment with over 50,000 titles to choose from. You can sign up for a free trial today and get your free downloadable audiobook by going to audiblepodcast.com/traveler. This week's guest, Erik, recommended the book Lost in My Own Backyard by Tim Cahill, which is about Yellowstone National Park. Get your free audiobook by going to audiblepodcast.com/traveler. I'd like to welcome back to the show Erik Smith, who's come to talk to us about Yellowstone National Park. Erik, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Chris.
And I say welcome back to the show. For those of you who haven't listened that long, Erik came on earlier because he has a quest to visit all of the U.S. national parks. And so he is a great lover of the national parks, as am I. How are we doing on the quest, first of all?
Well, I'm limiting the quest for right now to the lower 48, and I've got about 340 parks on the list, and I visited 243 of those so far.
And when we talked last time, we said that we would have him come back on and go into detail about some of the other parks, and Yellowstone seemed like a really good one. For one thing, the oldest national park in the U.S.
In the world, yep.
In the world. Well, I hadn't thought about that, but I suppose that's true. Okay. Why else should we talk about Yellowstone National Park? I won't steal your thunder here.
Well, it's a great summer destination. I have a few friends who are preparing to visit Yellowstone and Grand Teton this summer. Coming from Michigan, where I'm at, it's a perfect trip to the west. You get your mountain scenery, and you can stop and visit places along the way, like the Black Hills is about a one-day drive from Yellowstone, so you stop there, and then you hop into your good mountain scenery with all the unique features that Yellowstone has to offer.
Well, we also have done it as a driving trip from California when I was a kid, so it is accessible via a car trip without spending too much time in it unless you're very far away.
Yeah, and it's a long way from anywhere. It's a long way from California, a long way from Michigan, a long way from the East Coast, but that's part of the fun about the drive out is you know you're not at home anymore.
Well, and when you're driving through portions of Wyoming there, it feels like a particularly long way. My cousins in Colorado, I think we mentioned, have talked about Wyoming as a state that's kind of like a cake with all the frosting pushed up into one corner. And that would be Yellowstone and also Grand Tetons. We should mention the other beautiful area just south of there.
It's funny, that's absolutely true about Wyoming. You drive through on I-80 in the lower portion of the state, and it's Badlands, but it's not the pretty type Badlands that you have in Badlands National Park in South Dakota. It's higher elevation Badlands, which are just more windswept, and you drive through tiny little towns like Cheyenne. Even the capital's a very small town.
Right, in terms of windswept, my grandfather, when he lived in Cheyenne, said the way you measured whether the wind was blowing is you'd put a chain on a post in the center of town, and if the chain was whipping around, then they didn't consider that windy, but if it started to pop the links off the chain, that was considered a windy day, according to him.
Yikes, I know I've been camping in southern Wyoming where we couldn't get a grill lit or a campfire lit, period, because we just couldn't get enough flame with the wind there.
So let's go back to Yellowstone. What should we see in Yellowstone? Tell us a little bit about Yellowstone, the history of it, the layout of it.
It was declared a national park in 1872, and it became more peopled, obviously, in automotive times. That was when it became a big draw. And the park is laid out perfectly for a number of driving tours. Obviously, you're going to want to hike, and you're going to want to get off and do the boardwalks along the geothermal features. But the park, if you look at it, has two circular roads that connect, and it's sort of like a figure eight with a couple of entrance roads, one heading to the north, which leads you into Montana through Gardner, Montana, one to the west into West Yellowstone, Montana, and then the one into the east, which takes you to Cody, Wyoming. From any of those destinations you come in, and you can spend anywhere between 3 and 7 days just driving the loops.
Okay. You mentioned the geothermal features, obviously well known for that. Probably the best known geyser, of course, being Old Faithful. Not necessarily the most spectacular, but the most reliable.
That's a great point. It's the one everybody's heard of, but it's not the only one you should see. And the Upper Geyser Basin, where Old Faithful is located, is home to lots of great geothermal features. You'll see when you drive up to Old Faithful, first of all, you'll see the Old Faithful Inn, which is this beautiful old wooden structure from 1903 that was heroically saved during the forest fires of 1988. And it's a beautiful building to walk around in and just absorb the atmosphere. Many presidents have stayed there, and it's a cool thing to see. But then you get out on the boardwalks, and when you walk up to Old Faithful, the first thing you'll see is these bleachers which surround Old Faithful, and you think, oh, this is obviously the park's most important spot because this is where most of the people go. And it's a great place to watch Old Faithful from, but the real gem of the area is going up to the top of Observation Point, which is about a mile or a mile and a half hike, and it is up a hill, and you are at elevation. So it's going to wind you a little bit, but the view from up top of Observation Point is truly phenomenal, and you can see over the whole Upper Geyser Basin. You go up there first and you say, hey, I like the looks of that one. And when you come down, you can get back on the boardwalks and on the pass and walk over and see it in person. But it's a great place to start because you can see Old Faithful erupt from up there. And it's not as crowded because I would say probably 10% of the people actually do the hike up there.
Well, and my experience is that once you leave Old Faithful, it's not as crowded because a lot of people see Old Faithful and then get back in the car.
What a shame. It's true, though, and Old Faithful is where most people, I think, head right away. They think, well, you think Yellowstone, and that's the iconic image of Yellowstone.
Right.
Obviously, if you're going to Yellowstone, definitely see Old Faithful. But if you have one day and you're driving from one place to another and you're going to go through Yellowstone, The Upper Geyser Basin's a good place to start. You can see Old Faithful erupt. They have it timed out now to where when you walk up to it, there's a board there that says roughly the time it's supposed to go off. If you walk up and you have 70 minutes till the next eruption, there are all these wonderful boardwalks that take you around to some of Yellowstone's most surprising features. Again, you think Old Faithful, but then you can go around and see something like some of the other colored pools like Anemone Geyser and things like that. They're right in the area. And if you're worried about missing Old Faithful, you can see it from anywhere in the basin.
And if we spend a little more time there, we're going to do the trip up to the top. What are the other features should we make sure to see?
Well, I mentioned Anemone Geyser. That's one of my favorites. It's a pool. It's not your typical geyser, though it's called the geyser. It sort of fills up, and then it overflows, and then suddenly it will erupt. And it's a very unique feature. They've also got some of the great names. A lot of these geysers all over the park have absolutely great names. Another one is the Beehive Geyser, which...
I remember Beehive.
From the name, you'd probably figure it looks like a beehive. That's a very good one. And there's also the Lion Group, which has a bunch of different geysers, 4 to be exact, and they will erupt up to 80 feet, and they can go off for 1 to 7 minutes, and those are just sitting in a little group, and that's not a far walk from Old Faithful either. Like I say, most people walk up, see the sign that says, oh, we've got 40 minutes till Old Faithful erupts, and they sit down on the benches waiting for Old Faithful to erupt, and that's when you go and explore your other ones. It's not exactly in the area of Old Faithful, but the Morning Glory Pool is one of the favorite destinations that people have had for many years. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of vandalism, so the color of this particular pool has changed a lot over the year. If you look in the deepest part of the pool, you'll still see that amazing blue. It's almost a very light teal, but around the edge it's become more yellow, and that's because people, before we knew about environmental issues, thought throwing coins or cans or whatever in there was, for some reason, a good idea. I can't figure out how that would happen, but they did, and it caused the geyser itself to be plugged up, and that's what's caused this yellowish algae to grow in from the side. Yellowish algae is actually interesting looking, too, until you realize that it's not supposed to look like that.
And the other 2 geysers that I remember, I guess I've been there twice, once as a kid and then once right after college when my wife and I drove cross country. And the other 2 I remember are Castle Geyser, which is, again, like the Beehive Geyser, built up from the ground more. And then also Riverside Geyser, which goes off over the river at a bit of an angle. Both of those happen less frequently, and so you're less likely to see them if you're just going to that area at one particular time.
Right, they are less frequent, but they also go off for a little longer. Riverside Geyser, for example, can go off for up to 20 minutes at a time. Photographers especially like to go there and take photographs of the rainbows because the geyser actually erupts into the river, which causes the rainbows to be in the sunlight. It's a very pretty place to take pictures.
Okay. And then while we're on the geothermal theme, we should probably mention that that's not the only place in the park where you can see those kind of things.
No, it isn't, and I mentioned it in the podcast we did earlier. I like the Norris Geyser Basin a lot. There are 2 basins on either side of a mountain, and one is the Porcelain Basin, which has another famous feature called the Steamboat Geyser, which, if you're going there to see Steamboat go off, you might be waiting a couple years, because usually it's 7 or 8 years. It's been known to be 10 or 12 years between eruptions. But it's dramatically set on the side of a cliff, and it does bubble a lot, and it does shoot a little bit of water up in the air, but you can read about it, and they have pictures on boards along the boardwalk on the way down that show you how high Steamboat Geyser does erupt when it does. That's very impressive. The Porcelain Basin side of Norris Geyser also has Emerald Spring, which, as you can probably guess from the descriptive title, is a very pretty emerald pool. Another one that has been damaged by vandalism, but this one is a little bit more pristine even than Morning Glory. And Porcelain Basin has one of the best names of any geyser, one of my favorites, called the Puffin Stuff Geyser. And the geyser itself isn't very dramatic, I just really like the name. The other side of Norris Geyser Basin is called Back Basin, and that is a quite a bit longer walk, but it also has some geysers that have great names. One is called Whirligig, the other is called Pinwheel, and they also have a feature called the Black Growler Vent, which is a crack in the Earth's surface, and it doesn't shoot out water, obviously. It shoots out gas, which we should talk about the sulfur smell of Yellowstone right away. But
Right.
This is one of the places where you really get overwhelmed with the sulfur smell. The interesting feature about the black growler vent is that it disappears from time to time. It will fill in, and then it will pop up along the side of the mountain in another place. So it's kind of a moving feature.
And we should mention a little bit why there is so much geothermal activity in this area.
Well, the whole middle part of Yellowstone is basically the caldera of a volcano, a large volcano that is more or less extinct. But a lot of this is an offshoot of that volcanic activity right below the Earth's surface.
Well, I think relatively recently they've actually classified it as a supervolcano and dormant rather than extinct.
Right, dormant. Yeah, that's the proper term. That I think most people driving in there would probably feel better knowing they're visiting an extinct volcano than a dormant one. Every once in a while, you'll read online a paper where somebody is subjected that this volcano is ready to go off, and those would worry people. But I don't think that if the scientists thought that was going to happen, they'd let people in. But it is related to all the volcanic activity right below the Earth's surface.
Well, and we should be clear, too, that if it does go off, a supervolcano, because of the scale of it, they believe the last time it erupted, I believe that it covered like all of Nebraska and ash like 3 feet deep. So you don't really want to be in North America if it goes off. So going to Yellowstone is the least of your problems if that's really going to erupt.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it makes for a good thing to tell the kids. If you're not good, this volcano might go off. So.
Oh, just it reminded me of a traumatic incident when I was 5 years old visiting Lassen National Park in California, where I asked the question while we were standing in front of some thermal pools, Dad, do you ever think this could become a volcano? And right at that moment, after my father said, well, I don't know, maybe it could, they were blasting for a highway up on the area. My parents said if they hadn't caught my brother and I, we would still be running. So.
Oh, goodness. I can only imagine. See, there's your volcano trauma for the day.
Now, even if I hate geothermal and the smell of sulfur, there's something for me in Yellowstone. What else should I do in Yellowstone, even if I never want to see a geyser in my life?
That's a good point, that there are other things, because I have heard people say that after a while, after 2 or 3 days in Yellowstone, you get a little bit of geothermal fatigue. And there's always a lot of good things to see. Up in the northern part of the park is Mammoth Hot Springs, which is a small village at the site of what used to be Fort Yellowstone. The Albright Visitor Center is up there, and that's a really good visitor center. It gives you more than just the geothermal history. It gives you the people history of the park. There's also the Bunsen Peak Trail. We talk about geothermal features, but you got to remember it's a mountain park too. And Bunsen Peak, it's not your classic mountain hike. It's not a technical hike. It's only about 4 miles or so, but it does give you some great views over the valley. And it's something that, again, isn't geothermal. So if you're worn out on that, you can head up to the north side of the park. There's also the canyon area, which is
exactly
around the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, which is probably one of the most photogenic parts of the park. In scale, it's not the Grand Canyon from Arizona, but the colors are spectacular, and there are 2 waterfalls, the upper and lower falls, and there are good drives on both sides of the canyon. The North Rim Drive ends in a place called Inspiration Point, which is quite elevated and gives you an elevated view down over the valley, and then the South Rim Drive ends at a place called Artist Point, which is perfect because it's more of an artistic. I know people, photographers especially, really love the colors that come out from Artist Point.
Right, exactly. And then I think probably the other thing we need to mention would be wildlife.
Oh, yes, wildlife. I was lucky enough to see a grizzly bear across the river from a safe distance when I was there in 2006, and that was a real thrill. And the estimates are there are about 600 grizzlies in Yellowstone, and hopefully you don't run into one on a trail, but people say that there are a lot of sightings, especially early and late in the year before the real crunch of the tourist crowds hit in the middle of the summer. There's also black bears, which are a little bit more populous than the grizzlies, and those are smaller. And you can tell the difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear by the grizzly bear has a large hump in its shoulder area, and the color is different, although black bears can technically be brown too. Other wildlife, I know people always hear about the wolves of Yellowstone. In researching for this podcast, I looked today, and there's an estimate of somewhere between 120 and 180 gray wolves in the park. I have never seen one, They're very furtive, and they're a lot harder to see. I was told by a ranger that if you want to really try to see them, that the Hayden Valley, which is an area between the canyon we just mentioned and the fishing bridge area, more to the east side of the park, is a good place to try to see them, and early in the morning.
Because they're predominantly nocturnal, as I recall.
Right. But everybody's heard about or most people have, I should probably explain it for those who haven't. They reintroduced the gray wolf into Yellowstone after they had become extinct in this ecosystem, and it was such a good thing that they were able to take the gray wolf off the endangered species list. Now, ranchers and farmers in the surrounding areas have not enjoyed that reintroduction at all, but it has been a success story, and it's one of the things that Yellowstone and the National Park Service is really proud of.
The other wildlife encounter we had when we were there, besides obviously elk and deer and those sort of things that you'll see more regularly, was moose. We did see a mother moose and her cub, I want to say. No, what's a foal? Mice?
I don't know that one. I've never seen a moose there. I guess you're kind of lucky in that aspect. I really wanted to, and when I was down in Grand Teton, I was told when I pulled off at a scenic wayside that there was just one there, and I waited and searched, used the zoom on my camera, and never did find it. When you said another animal we should mention, I thought you were definitely going to go with buffalo, because they're everywhere
sure.
too.
Mm-hmm.
They just cover the park.
Or bison, we really mean when we say buffalo.
Right. They had a bad disease that the bison caught a couple years ago, which thinned the numbers out from somewhere about 4,500 down to 3,000. But you don't have to worry about not seeing them. They are everywhere. That's one reason that you really should obey the 40-mile-an-hour speed limit on Yellowstone roads, is because you can turn a corner and there will be 3 or 4 in the middle of the road. I know in 2006, just on my drive in from the east entrance coming from Cody, Wyoming, I had decided to come in very early in the morning because I was told the wildlife would be plentiful then, and it was probably 7:30 or so, and I drove in and turned a corner, and there were 4 buffalo in the middle of the road. And that's a neat thing to see, but you also don't want to hit them because they're quite big. They look so peaceful, and you hear stories of tourists walking right up to them and trying to pet them, but all the literature you get says, be very aware of the bison. Visitors are injured and killed every year by them. So they may look peaceful, but use your common sense. And of course, listening to the Amateur Traveler, you have to be a pretty savvy traveler. So I wouldn't expect I needed to give that warning to any of your listeners, but just in case they're talking to somebody else, you just be careful.
Yeah, I haven't seen somebody do that with a bison, but I've seen it do it with a large elk, not realizing probably how many people are injured by elk or moose. They're a big animal, and when they get spooked, and this one clearly was spooked, and they wanted to get their picture taken with this beautiful animal, and it wasn't too thrilled about it. I thought we were going to be able to record some very newsworthy event there for a moment.
It's funny because that's the stories that you hear. Bill Bryson, who you mentioned when you were talking about Audible, your sponsor there, he wrote a book a couple years ago. Actually, it was quite a while ago. It was back in the 80s where he traveled
Yeah, it's one of his earlier ones, Into the Woods.
No, this one was, I don't remember the name of it, The Lost Continent, maybe?
Okay, I know which one you're talking about.
He was living in England, he comes back to the United States, and he drives around.
I'm a stranger here myself.
Yeah, he describes how when he's in Yellowstone, he actually saw a tourist who thought it would be a good idea to get a picture with his kids on the back of a buffalo.
Oh, my goodness.
So, whether that's Bill Bryson's wild imagination, which comes through in a lot of his books, I don't know. I would hope that people would be smart enough to look at these magnificent creatures and think, they will just be walking in parking lots. I saw just a couple of them wandering through the Old Faithful parking lot when I was there in 2006 and thought, oh, this is just an accident waiting to happen. So hopefully people are smart enough around the buffalo that they're going to understand that this is still a wild animal. It may look domesticated being around all these people, but they're still wild.
Well, I think that's just perhaps natural selection at work there, trying to thin out the human herd.
Yes. Exactly.
This show is going to be one of the longer ones already, but I don't want to skip. You had mentioned the Grand Tetons.
It's so easy to overlook Grand Teton because Yellowstone is so incredibly diverse, but if you're going to Yellowstone, the Grand Teton is just to the south via a short drive on the John D. Rockefeller Memorial Parkway, which I must say sounds fancy. People conjure up images in their mind. It's pretty benign. It's just a road that connects the two parks. The Rockefeller Parkway showed me was how thoroughly a forest fire can damage a landscape, because when you drive the Rockefeller Parkway, you'll see remnants of the forest fires, not just the large one in '88, but also some of the ones that happened in the last decade. But you pass through that, and then you get into Grand Teton National Park, which I've seen a lot of mountains, and these are some of the most fetching mountains you will ever see. Everywhere you go in the park, they are visible to you, and you may have seen them 100 times already in one day, but you'll still find yourself pulling over at that wayside to get out and look at this magnificent wall of mountains that just lies right over the Snake River. They are just really attractive.
And it's odd that you use the term fetching. As the origin of the Grand Tetons, I'm not sure if you know that story.
I know the story, but I wanted to keep your clean label on the iTunes broadcast part. It was French travelers across the mountains who obviously hadn't seen women in a while and named them after a part of the female anatomy that I guess they had longed for after all their many months in the wilderness. So another great description of that comes from the same Bill Bryson book I just mentioned, where he describes the desperation of the French travelers, because you look at them and that's not what I think of, but that's where the name comes from.
No, well, in fact, they're named after the French word for breast, which is particularly odd considering that there are 3 predominant peaks. So it had been, as you say, a long time in the wilderness.
Yes, yeah. It's a great story, though. It's one of those where, yeah, you got to figure out if your kids are really old enough to handle that story, because I did look very carefully when I was in visitor centers. The National Park Service can be very politically correct, and I wanted to see how they were going to exactly approach that that particular story, and I couldn't find any mention of it there. Unfortunately, I wasn't having to travel with any teens or preteens, so I'd explain that story too, and then every time you get out of the car, I have to listen to them giggle at that story. So
sure.
There were a couple things in Grand Teton I'll mention real quick here. I had worried about it when taking notes. I did a page and a half of notes on Yellowstone and have 5 sentences on Grand Teton. I think that's probably what you get a lot of with Grand Teton. Everybody hears Yellowstone is overwhelmed by the size of that park, but there's good stuff in Grand Teton too. There are 2 historic sites that I like a lot. One is Meaner's Ferry, which is down on the south side of the park near the Moose Visitor Center. This was a turn-of-the-century ferry across the Snake River, and they have a restored trading post there and a restored church, or replica of those, not exactly restored. And then also the Cunningham Cabin, which is very basic, but gives you an idea of what the earliest settlers in the area had to go through in settling the area.
And as I recall, there's also a chapel in the Grand Tetons that's very popular for weddings, because basically the background for this chapel is the Grand Tetons.
Sure.
I'm drawing a blank on the name of it.
That's in the Meaner's Ferry area. I'm drawing a
Okay.
blank on the name too, but that is in the Meaner's Ferry area as well. Again, they mentioned it in the book I was looking through that said that the Tetons being your backdrop that would be a great place to get married. We did a float trip on the Snake River, and there are lots of companies where you can do this from, and our guide was great. One of the things he did was explain there are 6 very large peaks in the Tetons, and he explained which one was Grand, which one was Mount Owen, which one was Tewanot. And he also was able to point out wildlife that I think we probably would have missed had we just done the drive up and down the side of the Snake River. We were able to see bald eagles and ospreys, and
Sure.
it was really a fascinating thing to do, and not on the expensive side, more on the affordable side. Like I say, it was something that I'll never forget.
And when we say a float trip, we're talking about a 6-person inflatable raft?
Yeah, 6 or 8. It wasn't
6 or 8, something
it
like that.
wasn't whitewater rafting. I know.
And that's the difference between a float and a whitewater trip is usually your class 1, class 2 rapids or something like that.
Exactly. People would think to themselves, well, I don't want to be tossing up and down. It's nothing like that. It's very relaxed, and the guides are usually people who do that because they want to live in this area. Our guide had just recently got back from hiking Grand Teton, which you look at the mountain itself and you can tell that this is not a mountain you're just going to walk up the side of.
No, I've never been tempted to do that.
No, it's a very technical climb. People die every couple years attempting that climb, and it is one of the more difficult climbs. I guess a few of the other mountains are not as technical, but Grand Teton itself it's basically a 2-day climb. And there are a lot of companies that advertise to do that as well. I'm just not in that good a physical condition that I've ever wanted to try that.
And practical tips, places to stay, places to eat, any recommendations that you would add?
Well, if you're going to try to stay at Old Faithful Inn, you're going to spend a lot of money.
Right.
Obviously, it's a historic site, and it probably would be worth it. I would have spent one night there what I spent on my whole trip. The gateway towns are good places to start looking. You can camp inside the parks, but the gateway towns for Grand Teton, it is Jackson, Wyoming, the famous Jackson Hole to the south. There are
Right.
a lot of hotels and campgrounds in that area.
Also, a number of good restaurants in Grand Tetons in Jackson Hole.
In Jackson,
I found.
it's become a lot more posh over the years. I met a teacher when I was there last time who actually taught in the Jackson schools, but had to live across the Idaho border in a town over there because Jackson had become so expensive. But in Yellowstone, you're going to look at the gateway towns, specifically Gardner, Montana, which is by the north entrance, and West Yellowstone, Montana, which is by the west entrance to the park. And those are good places and probably a lot cheaper than Jackson Hole itself. In the east, if you're coming from the east like I would and like a lot of people do, Cody, Wyoming's a couple hours away.
Right,
and
too
Cody,
far.
Wyoming is a town that has all the amenities, but you're also quite a ways away from the park. You don't want to stay in Cody and commute into Yellowstone every day. It'd be smarter to stop in Cody, head into the park. There's also a lot of camping options in the park. The Fishing Bridge area has an RV park, and the one time I did stay in the park, we stayed in a cabin up in the Mammoth Hot Springs area, which happened to be on September 11th, 2001, which really taught me how far out in the middle of nowhere Yellowstone was. We came into the park in the morning and had absolutely no idea that anything had happened elsewhere in the world until about 4 in the afternoon. So it was getting dark in New York by the time we were able to find a TV. And I think that more than anything else just showed me how far in the middle of nowhere I was when I was in Yellowstone. We just had somebody mentioned it while we were sitting on one of the benches waiting for Old Faithful that something had happened at the World Trade Centers, and we tried to get radio and couldn't get any radio stations. It wasn't until we got back to our hotel where we actually learned something happened. So that's your middle of the nowhere Yellowstone story.
Well, and we stayed in West Yellowstone the last trip we were through there in one of the inexpensive motels there. I think at one point we thought we were going to leave our car there because our car was not dealing well with the altitude. It was a car that was used to being at sea level and it wasn't adjusted for that altitude and gave what we thought was its death rattle, but it turned out to start again eventually, and we were able to drive on to California. But
well, that would have been an interesting place to be doing podcasts from. So I've stayed in West Yellowstone too. I stayed in a particularly good KOA out in West Yellowstone. It's actually quite a bit outside. It's 8 or 9 miles outside the city itself, and it's a beautiful spot. It's hard to find spots that aren't beautiful in that area. Anywhere you're going to stay, you're going to have the beautiful sunsets over the mountains, and that's one of the advantages of the area. You're going to have to try to find an ugly spot there, and I don't think you can.
as we go to wind this down, is there anything else you wish that you had known before you went there?
I can't really say there's anything I wish I'd known. My first visit there was like you, when I was a kid. My parents took me out there, and I just remember the awe of the whole thing. I was 12 years old when we went out there the first time, and at 12 years old, you're starting to get a little bit jaded towards things, but there's no way that you can be jaded in this park. It's such a place of wonder that anybody of any age can love it. As far as things I wish I'd known, there are just so many resources out there now with the internet and guidebooks and everything. And if I could just recommend one guidebook real quick, the Yellowstone Association is a non-profit organization, and they can be found at yellowstoneassociation.org. They sell for $7, or at least that's what it was when I bought it, this beautiful color guide. It's called Yellowstone, the Official Guide to Touring America's First National Park. And it gives you a lot of what you're going to need to know so you're not caught off guard when you get out there. It doesn't have lodging and that kind of information. It's more of a park guide, but it's a great place to start.
Okay. You really know you're in Yellowstone when what?
Two things. The smell of sulfur and that very odd sound that elk make. It's their call. It's like a shrill whistle. You look at elk and they're big, and you think that they've got to make, like the bison, you hear them make the real husky hoofing sound. Well, the elk it's like a sheer whistle. The first time you hear it, if you don't see it coming from them, you're not going to know what it's coming from. It's almost like a whistle/scream. It's very, very strange.
And then if you had to summarize Yellowstone, and we'll throw in the Tetons also, in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Geothermal, diverse,
Okay.
and just gorgeous. I hate to use one that so many other people have used there, but every turn you make in Yellowstone, you think, boy, this is just amazing how lucky I am to have this as part of my country.
Erik, thanks so much for coming back on the show and sharing one of your favorite and also one of my favorite national parks and telling us a little bit about it.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for all the hard work you do on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to listen to.
Well, thank you. I'm going to skip the internet resources portion of this show, and I'm going to jump into the community section. And in the community section, I have 2 thank yous to offer, and they are to Hazel and Cindy, who heard the call when I asked for help doing some transcription for the show, and both of them have now sent me some transcripts for 2 different shows, and that is just a really big help, and I really appreciate those people who can help me out on the show. Some weeks, it gets to be a little too much. And I also got a chance to meet Cindy when I was down in Tucson last week, so that was an added bonus to this week. With that, we'll draw this episode of The Amateur Traveler to a close. If you have any comments, feel free to leave them at amateurtraveler.com or send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter if you are so inclined, which is twitter.com/Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more cathedral. Got to sit in one more cabin.